Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder if your brain decides to move before you consciously decide to move, like that feeling when you spontaneously reach for a cookie? Scientists have been asking this for ages. And today we're diving into a study that totally shakes up what we thought we knew about the timing of our decision. For decades, researchers have looked at brain activity right before we move. They often focus only on those moments that definitely end in a movement. Think about recording brainwaves, and when you see a specific pattern, a movement happened. It's like saying, okay, this brain pattern happened. And then a movement happened. So this pattern must have caused the movement, right? It is a little like looking at a pile of laundry and saying, okay, there is a pile of laundry, and then my socks are missing. So the laundry pile must have eaten my socks. It is not quite that simple. The problem is, what if that brain pattern happens sometimes, but no movement follows? Up until now, those instances were mostly ignored. This new study wanted to fix that. They created a clever new experiment. They had people look at pictures. Sometimes people would press a button to advance the picture. That is the active condition, where movement happens. But other times, the picture would advance on its own. After a similar amount of time, without the person doing anything, that is the passive condition, where no movement happens. Think of it like this. Imagine you are waiting for a bus. Active trials are like you deciding to wave at the bus to get it to stop. Passive trials are like you just waiting for the bus to arrive and you didn't do anything special. By having these two conditions that are super similar except for the actual movement, they could really compare brain activity. So, what did they do with the brainwave recordings, the EEG data? They used fancy computer programs called machine learning classifiers to try and predict whether a movement was going to happen just by looking at the brain activity. They compared what happened in the active trials, where a movement occurred, to the passive trials, where no movement occurred. Now, the big question has always been about early ramping activity. You might have heard of the readiness potential, or RP for short. This is a slow buildup of brain activity that scientists have observed happening maybe a whole second or more before you even move. Many thought this early ramp meant you've already made up your mind to move, even if you don't consciously realize it yet. It was seen as proof that our brains decide before we do. But here is where this study throws a curveball, even with their powerful tools. And this new comparison method, they found that this early ramping activity wasn't actually good at predicting movement. It was there, sure, like the laundry pile is always there, but it wasn't a reliable predictor of when you'd put your socks on. Instead, the real prediction power, the point where the computer could reliably tell if a movement was coming, only kicked in about 100 milliseconds before the actual movement. That is super close to the action. The researchers explained that the old way of analyzing things by only looking at when a movement happened made it look like there was early predictability. It is like if you only looked at successful marathon runners and saw they all ate a big breakfast, you might assume that eating a big breakfast guarantees you'll win a marathon. But you are missing all the people who ate a big breakfast and didn't even finish the race. This new study showed that when you use a proper control group, the trials where no movement happened, that early predictability disappears. So, what does this mean? It suggests that the early brain activity, like the RP, might not be a sign that you fully committed to acting. Instead, it could just be a general state of readiness or anticipation. The actual decision, the point of no return where you are truly committed to moving, seems to happen much closer to the movement itself. This fits much better with our own feelings, where we often feel like we decide just before we act, and it also aligns with how late we can sometimes stop ourselves from doing something. Think about it, if you've decided to leap off a cliff 2 seconds before you jump, the decision is long made. But if you decide to press a button to advance a slide, and you can still easily stop yourself 200 milliseconds before pressing it, that means the commitment wasn't really locked in that early. This study supports that idea, showing the brain activity doesn't show a firm commitment until much later. This is a really important distinction. Just because something reliably comes before an event doesn't mean it reliably predicts that event. The laundry pile reliably precedes putting on socks, but it doesn't predict when you'll put them on. This study highlights the critical need for good control conditions in science. Without them, we can easily get fooled by our data, seeing patterns that look important but aren't actually driving the outcome. When the researchers looked at the data the old way, time-locked to the movement, they did see that familiar early slow downward brain activity, the MRCP, kind of like the readiness potential. This is what most previous studies have focused on. They also saw other typical signs like changes in brainwave frequencies. But when they used their fancy machine learning on the new active versus passive design, the story changed. The ability to predict a movement only really started ramping up just before the movement. It was like the computer could only guess with about 50/50th accuracy until very close to the action, and then it got much better. They even showed that if you use the old method of comparing activity right before movement to a much earlier time window, you can get surprisingly high prediction accuracy, even with data that has no real signal in it. This is because the brain signals, like the readiness potential, are often autocorrelated, meaning nearby signals are similar. So, comparing a signal now to a signal from a while ago, when that earlier signal is also part of a slow trend, artificially inflates the perceived predictability. It's like saying the last 5 minutes of this song sounded a bit like the first 5 minutes, therefore the last 5 minutes predict the end of the song, when really it's just the general style of the song. So their big takeaway is that the early brain activity we see, while interesting, isn't the smoking gun for an early decision. It might be more like a background hum, a general preparation, or even just random brain noise that happens to be more common when we're about to do something. The real decision to act seems to be a later event, happening much closer to the actual movement. This fits better with our everyday experience and the ability we have to change our minds at the last minute. This study strongly supports what are called late decision accounts, suggesting that the brain commits to an action relatively late in the process, close to when the movement actually happens. This is a significant shift from earlier interpretations that saw the readiness potential as evidence of an early unconscious decision. It helps resolve some long-standing debates about free will and conscious intention. The researchers acknowledge some limitations, like the fact that their active and passive tasks, while closely matched, still differed in the anticipation of proprioceptive feedback, the feeling of your own body moving. But they argue this difference would only make it easier to classify the trials, not harder, and that their powerful analysis method should have picked up any real predictive signal if it existed early on. They also admit that their findings are based on EEG, which measures brain activity from the scalp. It is possible that very subtle early commitments might be happening at the level of individual neurons, which EEG might not be sensitive enough to detect. However, based on the signals that EEG can detect, including the famous readiness potential, the evidence points towards decisions being made much closer to the action. So, what is my take on this? This study is a fantastic example of how crucial good controls are in science. By creating that passive, no-movement condition, they were able to strip away the noise and see what was truly predictive of movement. It really does make you question those early findings about the readiness potential and what they actually mean. They're not necessarily a commitment, but perhaps just part of the general ebb and flow of brain activity that leads up to action. This research could have implications for understanding things like how we plan movements, how we learn new skills, and even how we control certain neurological conditions where movement initiation might be affected. Future research could explore this further, perhaps using even more sensitive methods than EEG or MEG, or by looking at different types of movements. It is a fascinating puzzle, and this study has definitely given us a clearer picture of the timeline of our intentions. What do you all think? Does this change how you view your own decisions to move? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive, give this video a like, subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more science explained simply, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the mind. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.